reports and these pictures that we're getting from Caracas?
Well, Anna, we've been waiting for it. It was clear in the run-up to Christmas that something was likely to happen because the force that the United States has had in the Caribbean, this big naval force of assault landing ship, the Iwo Jima, the Gerald R. Ford, the biggest aircraft carrier in the world, 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers, a submarine, troop ships. They couldn't keep all of that at sea and ready to go forever. They had to either use it or stand it down. And there's a big air presence been put into Puerto Rico. The Americans got an air base called Roosevelt Roads, commonly known as Rusi Roads, in Puerto Rico. And they've got F-35s operating from there. They've had even some of the B-52 bombers have overflown Venezuela a little while ago. And they've got the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit available, which is a group of about 10,000 or 3 to 10,000 Marines who could be put together for a land operation. So this force was never going to be sort of held at readiness and then just stood down without something happening. And we were waiting for something to happen. Now, I think as Stuart said, President Trump said a couple of weeks ago, just before Christmas, that an air attack had taken place on a port facility, but he didn't report any more than that. And there were no real reports coming out of Venezuela. But this is a pretty confirmed report. As you said, 4 places, Caracas, Miranda, Aragua, and Nagaria, all of whom the Venezuelans are saying have been hit. And that's certainly logical. I've seen a couple of reports in the last 4 or 5 minutes that the international airport in Caracas may have been one of the targets. That's unconfirmed. That's just something that's coming up on social media. So I think we'll get a lot more in the next hour as to what these targets really are. What the purpose behind them is harder to determine. The fact that Trump was likely to launch some form of military action, I think, was 90% certain from before Christmas. But what he's trying to achieve here is not entirely clear. I mean, I think there's 2 big strategic motives behind all this. One is to attack the boats, and over 30 boats have now been attacked. Over 100 people have been killed without any evidence that they are who the Americans say they are, but that's what they've done. And what they're trying to do is send a message to all of the drug dealers in the whole region, not just in Venezuela, which mainly traffics drugs from Colombia. It doesn't produce all that many itself, but it traffics them for sure. But to send a message to all of the drug dealers that this is not a good time to be setting off on boats to come to the United States or anywhere else for that matter. So there's a general deterrent message there. But the other message is to the Maduro government that your time is up and that you've got to leave government now. And Maduro had offered, as it were, some tough terms. He might have stood down on terms that the Americans found unacceptable. That goes back a couple of months. And so he's been sitting tight, obviously deciding that the Americans won't dare to land troops in Venezuela because that would be very, very unpopular in the United States. So what are they trying to do by launching some sort of bombing campaign to create a sense of crisis, maybe to bring the opposition out onto the streets? And Maria Machado, the leader of the opposition, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, remember, about a month ago, I mean, she wrote a very interesting article in The Economist about 3 weeks ago now, saying that, the opposition hasn't been lying low. I mean, we are being arrested, but we are planning. We have an organization that is ready to take over government, and you don't see it, but it's there. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know. But she was making it pretty clear that the opposition are in a position throughout the country to take over. But that will be easier said than done because Maduro, he's got an army of 100,000 troops. None of them will die for him. But a lot of them have got a big, big stake in the drug trafficking that goes on in Venezuela. And he's got a paramilitary force twice that size, about 220,000 paramilitaries. So he's probably got a force of maybe 10 or 20,000 very loyal troops and paramilitaries who won't die for him, but they will certainly try to preserve their position, and they won't easily give up power because the Americans are bombing a few sites.
Had been concerned, I think, about the possible implications of US military intervention. Certainly its proponents feel that this would pave the way for regime change, for the opposition to take power, led by the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, or perhaps the opposition's candidate in the 2024 elections, Edmundo Gonzalez. However, there are some who are critical of Maduro, critical of the Venezuelan government, desperate for a change in government, but we're still very nervous about the idea of direct US military intervention because of the potential further destabilization that may cause in the country. Part of the reason, I think, for some of that concern, even among Maduro's critics, is that he still has allies in the country. He still has government ministers who have, until this point at least, as far as we know, remained very loyal to him. The military, the heavily armed paramilitaries in the country have all remained heavily loyal to Maduro so far. And so there is certainly concern about what will those figures now be thinking? Will they want to now try and defend themselves? How could that go? And I think certainly there will be many, many of his close allies and inner circle very worried about their own futures right now, having seen what has happened to Nicolas Maduro.
And in the interim, of course, there is this power vacuum. What mechanisms does the government have to put in place in that interim?
Well, I think at the moment we will expect to hear further announcements from government coming from other members of the government, potentially the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, the Defence Minister, Vladimir Padrino, all of these key figures who remain, as far as we know, as I say, in the country for now, certainly still wanting to show, at least publicly, that they are going to put up a fight. But as I say, what we don't know really is what their capabilities to do so will be, and also whether the US has its eyes on further allies. One kind of important piece of context to this intervention that we have seen today is that very recently the US accused what it described as the Cartel de los Soles, an alleged criminal organization, which it said was being led by Nicolas Maduro himself, of being a foreign terrorist organization. Now, this wasn't a sort of cartel in the traditional sense. This was a name that the US used to describe, as I say, Nicolas Maduro and his inner circle, some of those loyal to him, who the US accused of being involved in criminal organizations and things like drug trafficking, in human trafficking and illegal mining. Because of that designation, it was thought in the region that the US might try to justify, as I say, a wider campaign to remove some of these people from power, to hold some of these people to account in the US's legal system. And as we were talking about earlier, there was a huge bounty on Nicolas Maduro, a $50 million reward that had been announced for any information leading to his arrest. So I think certainly from the US's perspective, that designation was seen as justification to target potentially many members of the Venezuelan government, not just Nicolas Maduro, and potentially many members of the military too. However, I think there will be even allies of the US very concerned and surprised at the level of direct intervention that we have seen, which we haven't seen in the region since 1989, since direct US military intervention in Panama to depose the then military leader. So this, in modern history, is completely unprecedented.
We know President Trump has often said he wanted regime change, and this is just the first step, though. Who do you think the US would want to see replace Maduro?
I think the US has been very clear that it supports the Venezuelan opposition, which is led by Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader, who recently travelled to Oslo to collect her Nobel Peace Prize. She fled Venezuela undercover in a treacherous journey across sea and land to get to Oslo. We don't know her whereabouts at the moment. She's been living in hiding since the 2024 election, briefly reappearing at a protest in 2025 when Nicolas Maduro was inaugurated to essentially protest against his re-election. She was then briefly captured, so she has been living in hiding ever since. The opposition, who was led by Maria Corina Machado, but whose candidate was Edmundo Gonzalez in the 2024 election, have published tallies from that election, which they say show categorically that they, not Nicolas Maduro, won that election. And the US has been a firm ally of the Venezuelan opposition ever since. Maria Corina Machado has been pretty bullish herself when she has done media appearances over the last couple of months in particular. She has been pretty clear that while she's sort of shied away from questions about whether she would support the kind of bombing and strikes that we've seen today, she's been pretty clear that she does want the US's support to overthrow Nicolas Maduro, that she does believe the opposition would be a strong ally of the US and would open up, for example, its oil industry again, something that the international community has at times called for. So I think certainly it's pretty clear that the US has a natural ally already in the opposition. The question is whether really that would be possible.
And also, would Machado be welcomed with open arms by the Venezuelan population? Could she be a stabilising force in that way?
I think that's a really important point because she does remain a controversial figure in Venezuela. There are members of the sort of Maduro government and those loyal to the Maduro government that, of course, do not support her. But there are also people who are very critical of Nicolas Maduro and of the current administration who still feel nervous about the level of allyship, for example, that Maria Corina Machado has shown to President Donald Trump. I've spoken to some Venezuelans over the last couple of months, for example, who say that they fear US intervention, that they don't like the current government, but they also do not want the sort of intervention that they feel like Maria Corina was calling for. So it isn't by any means kind of certain that she would be necessarily, as you say, welcomed with open arms in the country.
Ione,
welcomed with open arms in the country.
Ione, thank you. That's our South America correspondent, Ione Wells.